Great. Okay, so thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. My name is Beth Tweedy. I'm a new librarian here at UC Davis. I work in the Researcher Services Department, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. But today, I wanted to talk to you all about how to craft a presentation. Just a little bit of background about me. So I actually am not a librarian by training. I kind of accidentally found librarianship. I did a master's and a Ph.D. in biology and ecology and evolutionary biology. I studied freshwater mussels, mercury contamination in streams, climate change, things like that. So it wasn't too long ago that I was a graduate student like y'all, so I remember all of that. And one of the things that I found in my graduate education was really inconsistent how much support and instruction and training that graduate students got on developing presentations, when at the same time presentations can be really, really important to your career, your success, things like that. A lot of the most pivotal moments that you'll have in any kind of academic line career, you know, your qualifying examinations, your defense, your job talks, big talks at conferences to get a postdoc, things like that, all require presentations. I wanted to, or I've kind of been, one of the projects I've worked on as a librarian is developing services and presentations and consultations and things to help students improve their general presentation skills, but also to help with specific presentations. Looks like this stopped working. Okay, there we go. So some of the things we're going to cover today, I don't always like giving a big overview, especially when your overview consists of, okay, we're going to do the introduction, then we're going to talk materials and methods, then we're going to talk results, then we'll have a discussion, then we'll be done. Everybody knows that's coming. But for the sake of a more kind of instructional talk like this, I like to go over that. So this was kind of pitched as all the parts of your talk that aren't your slides. So we're not going to talk about designing slides, putting slides together. We're going to talk about other things. So things like considering your audience, defining what your communication goals are, selecting what content you do and don't include in your presentation, taking stock and considering the setting that you're going to be giving that presentation in, crafting a narrative or a story structure to map your research or your work onto, and a few kind of tips for how you can be more effective and engaged in your delivery with your audience. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have some time for some questions, things like that, if there's things I didn't get to or you want clarification. Also, if at any point you just have a burning question that you really want to ask, feel free to throw a hand up and interrupt me. That's perfectly fine. So before we get into it, one thing I did want to know, does anybody know about the Researcher Services Department here at the library? All right, so that's good. That's what I'm a part of, and this is an example of the sorts of services that we provide, presentations. But we actually have a team of several librarians across all sorts of subjects, STEM librarians, arts and humanities librarians, business and economics types things, agriculture, whatever area of the university you're at, we have a librarian who can help you with things like research consultations. You can come to us to help find journal articles. We can help you with data management plans. We can direct you to resources for data analysis. Even if we can't help you, we can usually put you in touch with someone who can. You can get in touch with us at researcherservices@ucdavis.edu. So if you need any support like this or anything else, please reach out to us. We're here to help. Starting with thinking about considering your audience. So this is, and the order that I put these in is kind of the process that I go through when I'm thinking about a presentation. So before I start making slides, before I start doing anything else, I want to think about who my audience is and just spend some time reflecting on who they are, how they relate to me, and that's going to kind of set some boundaries or some parameters about what's going to make my talk successful. So I like to think about their interest. Where are they on the kind of range of, are they going to be really interested in what you're talking about? Maybe kind of indifferent, they don't care, or are you actually going to have to be winning their interest over and hooking them? For this talk, since you had to register for it and come here, I kind of tended to assume that most of you were pretty interested in this. Maybe a few of you are indifferent and just wanted the free pizza and figured you could sit through a talk for it, but probably not a lot of you where I have to actively kind of pull you into the presentation here. If this was something that was mandatory and you all had to be here and you didn't have a choice, I'd craft things a little differently to account for that side of things. Thinking about their background. Are they really closely subject aligned to what you're talking about? So for this presentation, it's not quite as obvious, but for thinking about my own work, so I did research on freshwater mussels. When I went to the Freshwater Conservation Society meeting, I could pretty much assume that everyone at that meeting knows a little bit about mussels. So I would kind of set those expectations. I don't need to dive too deeply into what a mussel is, how it works, that sort of stuff. They know what I'm talking about there. There can be subject adjacent people. So people who, using that example again, when I went to the ecotoxicology and environmental science meetings, they would know some elements, but I probably had to introduce them to mussels, make sure that everybody was on the same page. They knew what a mussel is, how it works, things like that. And it looks like I left it out, but there can also be people who have, no subject alignment at all. So if I'm going and giving a talk in a pretty general setting where there could be anybody there, there could be, English people, history people, things like that. They have no subject expertise in my area, so I need to think about that. Their knowledge base. So thinking about the knowledge that they have to draw from in order to, build off of, or you can build off of there. So again, thinking about subject experts, general experts, non-experts. Do they know the specific words, the terms, things like that to dig into there? Where do they align there? And then considering their disposition as well. Are they going to be more accepting of the message that you're trying to deliver? And so you're talking to a pretty friendly audience. A lot of, conference meetings and things like that, they're going to be in the accepting range, maybe the neutral range. Drifting into hostile, I got to give some talks in Oklahoma about climate change to the general public. And so some of those people tended to skew more to that hostile side. And so I had to adjust how I package that message and things like that to account for the fact that my audience doesn't necessarily want to hear what I'm going to say. So plan for that. There's a saying that I like to kind of sum all of this up, and it's kind of my guiding principle when it comes to considering my audience. And that's never underestimate the intelligence of your audience, but don't overestimate their knowledge. So I tend to shy away from terms like dumb it down or, overly simplify and things like that. You don't want to assume your audience is stupid, because if you approach your talk with that kind of mindset, then why are you even giving it? If you're thinking that these people aren't capable of understanding what you're saying, then you're just wasting everybody's time. So don't think of them as stupid. Don't think of it as you have to drop it down to their level. Think of them as intelligent, but also don't assume that they know everything you know. And if there's some doubt or you think they may not actually know about this concept or this term, take the time to explain it, to teach it to them. Any presentation you do, I think, has a heavy teaching element, whether you're actually in a classroom or whether you're up in front of a bunch of, faculty and postdocs at a conference. You're doing teaching. And so you do need to think about what knowledge they have, what you need to teach them. Any thoughts or questions here? Yeah.
Sorry, you said you're reading background.
Yeah.
Is that more of a specific term that they know? Background is kind of like,
yeah. Yeah, so I would kind of think of those two like knowledge base. So subject aligned being like, are you a STEM person? You understand how STEM research generally works versus, a historian who understands that process, versus, someone who's working in arts and music and things like that. And so kind of how closely aligned you'd align to like the methodologies and general tone and stuff like that. Whereas I would think of knowledge base being more, all right, if you have the same knowledge base, you're probably within the same subject area. But, if I'm talking about field ecology and mesocosm experiments versus, a microbiologist talking about petri dishes and that sort of methodology, we're in the same subject, but we don't have the same knowledge base that we're drawing from to understand there. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. All right. So once you kind of take stock of that shape of your audience, who they are, what their interest is, what their knowledge is, what their disposition is, again, before you're ever creating any slides, I like to think about defining your communication goals. So what's the purpose of this talk? Why are you giving it? What's the point? And the kind of exercise that I do to try and help with this is, imagine that you are walking out of that talk after you've given it, and there's two people in front of you, and one of them looks to the other and says, what did you get from that talk? What is the one thing, short kind of one sentence answer that you want to hear that you will have considered your talk a success if those people say it? So think about what that primary take-home message is, that above anything else, if they only get one sentence takeaway from your talk, what is that going to be? And then that's going to underpin your entire presentation. When I start crafting something that I'm giving that's more directed and I'm trying to make a point, I kind of have that written off to the side on a sticky note or something. This is the point I'm trying to get across. And then that can become kind of your meter stick as you're trying to decide what content to use. If you want to put this figure in, things like that, you can always tie it back to, does this support that goal of getting this point across? And, to the expense of anything else, I want to make sure I get this point across. So that's kind of your primary thing. You can, especially for audiences, and for some talks, that may be it. You have one point you want to get across in the time you have, and everything is about getting that main point across. For audiences that you think are likely to be more engaged, I like to think about maybe 1 to 2 secondary points. For those that are more interested and are tuning in and putting some effort into listening and, taking notes, things like that. Okay, what are some extra things that I would like someone to get? And then you can consider maybe some tertiary points, a few of those for your fellow nerds, the people who are going to really be into whatever that topic is and really kind of eat it up and get into the nitty-gritty. It could be, in one of my presentations, it might be my big take-home message is that freshwater mussels influence how mercury moves through an ecosystem. That's my main message. That's all I'm expecting anyone to get out of that talk if they're just barely paying attention. So everything's built around that. For the secondary points, I might tie in a little bit about what specific methods or, ecological mechanisms I think they're using. Might tie in, some methodologies that I use. For the really nerdy people, I'll get into specific taxa of mussels and how one taxa differs from another, things like that. But you want to define these out before you start doing anything. So that way, then you have a goal that you're working towards. And then as you start making decisions about your presentation, or you start testing it out on people and you give a practice run, you can ask them at the end, all right, one sentence, what did you get out of that talk? And if they say what your primary goal was, then it was probably a pretty good talk. If they're like, I don't know, or they say something completely different, sample sizes, don't take one person's word for it, but you might want to recalibrate if you're not hitting your mark there. Any thoughts or questions about this? All right, moving along. I will note this is my first time doing this in this format here, so we may come in a little bit under. We may have to speed up there at the end. We're going to see how it goes. But the next step I kind of do is I start thinking about my audience, my communication goals. Now is the step when you want to start thinking about what your content you're going to include in. What are you going to talk about? How deep you're going to go. And this is informed by some of those other levels. If you have a very subject aligned, very shared knowledge base audience, you can probably start to go really, really deep in that. If they're not as interested, they're not as subject aligned, they don't have that knowledge base, you're probably going to have to keep things more surface level and not be able to take some of those deep dives. So think about how much depth you want to and can go into. Think about the breadth that you're going to cover and tying back to those communication goals. If you have a very specific point that you want to make, it may not be worthwhile to go talk about a bunch of other things, but to keep that talk very narrowly focused just on things that support that one point that you want to make there. So do I just go through 3 or 4 examples that support that one main point? Or am I trying to make a broader point that like climate change is a thing that's going to affect us in the future? And so I'm going to not go as deep into the examples, but I'm going to go very broad and pick a bunch of examples from a bunch of different things that I can pull in and go that way. The amount of content, so both depth and breadth, and we'll touch on this a little bit more, but how much total information are you throwing at them? That's something that you want to keep in mind here. And then kind of looking through, assuming this is one of your researcher talks or something, what are the pieces of evidence, the stories, the things like that that you have that help you make those points you want to make? I'll also note that this isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all way to go through this. You may have a research study and you have those graphs and things already, and you want to include all of them. So then you may kind of front load that and say, from this stuff, what's the point I want to make? So it's not always, a completely de novo. I start blank from it, but thinking about what content is appropriate, what content helps you get to that point and is appropriate for your audience. So you've thought about your audience, you've kind of got a broad thing of your content, what stories you want to touch on, what data points you want to show, things like that. It's also important to consider the setting that you're giving that in as much as possible. And I'll kind of caveat all of this is a moving scale based on how important the talk is, how much time you have, and how much control you have over these things. For really important talks, I like to ask, how big is the room I'm going to be giving this talk in, so I can design my visuals appropriately, so I can think about, am I going to need a mic to talk? So I can just kind of mentally prepare for the space I'm going to be in, how many people I'm looking at, things like that. Thinking about your audience size. If you're wanting to do something more interactive, that might be harder if you have a huge audience. But even just, you can tailor elements of it and kind of prep a tone. If you're talking to 5 people versus 50 people, those can be 2 very different talks and 2 different ways of approaching it. So if you can get some handle on what that audience size is going to be, thinking about if there's going to be other presenters going on, if this is something like this, where for this event, I'm the only speaker here, I'm not worried about you guys being burned out from another talk right before me or another talk before that. So I'm not competing with other presenters or simultaneous presenters necessarily as much right now. At a conference, you have to consider the setting that you're in there is going to affect your audience. If you're the last talk on the last day of the conference, people are going to be pretty burned out, and that's a little bit of a different setting than if you're the first one, or if it's an invited talk that you're giving where you're the only one. All of those different things about the setting that you're in there can affect everything that came previously to that. And then thinking about conventions and expectations. There's some conferences, and some of this you find out through trial and error, just you don't know. Some of them you can talk to an advisor, someone else. There's going to be some conferences where you're pretty much expected to just stand right here talking to the microphone, and you're not going to have the freedom to move around, to redirect, things like that. There's going to be some where it's here, I can come over here at a point, versus if I know that the slides are way up above me, I either want to design my slides differently or have a laser pointer or something to do that. Even down to how much time you have, if you're expected to leave 3 minutes solidly for questions. All of those sorts of things about the setting that you're giving a presentation in are going to affect the decisions that you make to kind of craft that presentation. Any comments or thoughts so far? Yeah.
Which is more professional, the slide or the screen and show?
It depends. There's pros and cons to each, and it depends a lot on the presenter. And it's going to be different in different fields, and even within the same field at different conferences, we'll have different things. Most conferences, for the simplicity of setting it up, is going to just have a podium mic like this, and you can't really do much else than that. I think that if you're comfortable doing it, if you can move and engage and move around, that would be a good thing to help pull your audience in. Humans are drawn to movement, things like that. It's also a great way, which we'll talk about a little bit, to gauge your audience's attention. If I'm not sure how happy you are, if I move over here and you follow me over here, then that tells me, okay, you're connected with me, you're engaging me. That's kind of taking your audience in, communicating with them. Everybody looked over here. So right now I have your attention. You haven't tuned me out yet. If I move over here and everybody's just kind of staring off into space and nobody picks up on that change, then I might want to do a pause, or I might want to kind of reset, or maybe try and crack a joke or do something to try and get people's attention, pull them back in, do something there. So I personally like, if I have the freedom to move around, I think it can make it a more engaging presentation. It makes it easier to pull your audience in. But especially if you have a mic and you're set up and the convention is everybody just stands here and gives their talk, unless you're wanting to intentionally make a statement by breaking that convention for some reason, I'd probably lean to just, go and do that too, based on the setup you have. But it can be a lot different. I've been at, conferences where everybody just stands there and talks. I've been to ones where people are more free and moving and things like that. So there's not one right answer. Watch what you see at conferences, ask people in your field what they see, ask your advisor if they have thoughts on it, because they might be like, oh no, don't move. I know one person who moved and they got, made fun of the entire rest of the conference because they wouldn't stand there. So yeah, does that answer your question? Any other thoughts, questions? Okay. So after you've kind of done that prep work, you've kind of thought about some of those parameters. Still, I don't think you want to start making your slides yet and start throwing slides together. This is one of the things that it took me the longest to kind of figure out how to do with presentations, but that's creating a narrative for your presentation. So one of my biggest pet peeves is presentations that are just a whole bunch of slides just slammed in together. It's like, and now we're going to talk about this, and now we're going to talk about this, and now, and this, and now, and there's no thought put into how to do it. I mean, you've probably been in those sorts of presentations where it's just on and on and on and on. And so I think to make a more engaging presentation, you want to try and map what you're doing onto a story. I think humans are very oriented towards stories, storytelling, and listening to stories is something that we're really primed to do. So if you can tell a story instead of just talk at people, that's going to really help build that or kind of build that connection. So there's lots of different story arcs that you can use. If anybody in here is, a literature and English person, I'm sure you've studied this in great detail. But for most talks, this structure I found works pretty well. Kind of starting with exposition, rising action, a climax, falling action, and then the resolution. So to kind of start with the storytelling thing, I like to use one of my favorite movies, Jurassic Park, to give kind of some examples of what this looks like in something that's obviously a narrative. So we start here with the exposition. You're introducing your main characters, right? You're introducing Dr. Grant, Dr. Sadler. You're introducing the world and setting kind of expectations around it. Dinosaurs are in the world. This is what they look like. You might introduce some side characters that people kind of care about or bring some unique flair to it, like Dr. Malcolm. And you can even, emphasize some traits, like the fact that Dr. Grant, not that great around kids, tells them about how dinosaurs would eat them, things like that. So you're setting the stage there. Then you're going to get to the rising action, and that's where you're starting to set stakes. You're starting to build suspense. You're starting to kind of get the audience thinking. So things like hinting at the velociraptors. There's some really dangerous dinosaurs on this island. That might come into play later. Showing a sick triceratops. Everything's not okay. They don't seem to have the dinosaurs as nailed down as they do. There's a sick one here. What's up with that? The fact that there's a storm coming. What's going to happen if the storm gets there? Obviously, stuff's going to be bad. Then you get up to the climax. In this example, or the way I'm framing it, that's when the power goes out and the dinosaurs break loose. Everything shifts. Everything's different now. The dinosaurs are out. They're chasing people. They're getting eaten. All of that stuff. So it's a different kind of story now. Something's happened, and now you're dealing with the fallout of that. You're following up on characters, how they're navigating through that, how they're getting through it. They're dealing with the problems that were presented by that climax, getting the power back on, getting to safety, getting away from the dinosaurs. And then you get to the resolution where you kind of, show how everything ended, who lived, who died, they get off the island. You can have some, callbacks to the beginning where Dr. Grant started not being cool with kids, and now he's actually kind of okay with them. And you can even have some broader philosophical things by like panning over to the pelicans flying. And since birds are dinosaurs, the dinosaurs are still here, and kind of have this philosophical moment there too, if you want to. So hopefully, obviously, since this is a movie, it has a narrative arc that makes sense. But if you're talking about research, how do you take something, a scientific study, and how do you make it into a story? So I'm going to use an example from my research. You're not getting a full research talk here, but I'm just going to talk about some of the points that I go through, or I would go through with my work in freshwater mussels and mercury, and how I think of that research in a story context. So exposition, just like before, we're setting up main characters. In the context of research, those are the things that your audience needs to know in order to understand your talk. So this is where we're tying into thinking about, their knowledge depth, their breadth, all of those things. In my case, I think you need to understand about mercury, because if you don't know what mercury is, a whole talk about mercury is not going to make sense. So I teach you some of the stuff what mercury is, how it works, how it gets into the environment, where it comes from. The other thing that I think you need to understand is food webs and how those work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about food webs, introduce those characters, what we know about them, what we think we know about them, things like that, and make sure we're all on the same page for the story we're about to tell. You know what mercury is, you know what a food web is, cool, now we can move on. Then I'm going to try and build some suspense. I'm going to set some stakes. A lot of times in scientific talks or research-based talks, this is starting to set up problems or unknowns. So I talk about how, this mercury gets into food webs, it gets into fish. It's really unsafe for especially people who might get pregnant or developing embryos. There's these fish contamination warnings all over the country. And what's more, you have all of these rivers in rural Oklahoma where they're monitoring the lakes, but nobody's looking at what's in the rivers. So we have no idea if, because there's a mercury advisory in that lake, does that also mean the fish in the river are unsafe to eat? So I'm pausing questions, I'm posing questions, trying to make you think about what's going on? I really want to know, kind of build that anticipation. And of course, since it's my talk, I was thinking I have the answer. Then the climax, that's where you put in your idea, your contribution, whatever it is that you're doing to either advance your field forward or to bring a new idea in or research or fill in a gap. For me, it's this little model I came up with of how I think mussels affect, the movement of mercury through there, and kind of that conceptual model. And that's really kind of that inflection point where you say, here's my idea, here's what I'm doing. This is, going to change the field. Then you've got your falling action and STEM research like I do. That's where I start going into, I'm going to back that up. Now that here's the big thing that changes stuff. Now we're going to talk about, the field methods I used and go through all my methods and how I did the studies, show you the data I got that I think backs this up and makes it convincing that this idea that I've shown you is right. And so for whatever your field is, that's where you talk about the work you did, talk about if this idea is true, these are the things we expect to see, things like that. And then the resolution, you're kind of tying it all up. You can go back to, just like the movie did, to those introducing characters. Did you overturn that maybe food webs aren't important or they're more important than we thought? Does it change your understanding of how mercury works in toxin or rivers? You can even tie, into some broader concepts of the field. So here I'm talking about mercury affects the whole globe, it affects climate change, affects all of it, and there's other things that affect the whole globe. So that's that broader tie out where I'm trying to be all fancy and it works, for everything. So that's kind of the idea of the narrative arc there. Introducing your characters, the things that people need to know about your research, set some stakes, your idea, back that idea up, and then kind of tie it all together, relate it back to those things that you introduced. How does this change things? How does this move things forward? Any thoughts about that? Questions? Yes.
So then depending on what your talk is, you adjust the time that you're allocating for speech.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so how do you kind of manage?
Yeah, so this will be my answer a lot. It depends. So generally for most scientific talks, and I'm going to draw a lot on my own field here as a, ecologist. In a 12-minute, research talk, I'm usually trying to spend 1 to 2.5, maybe 3 minutes in the intro. That rising action, that's usually pretty quick. You don't want to dwell on that too much because you really want yourself to be the star. So just like a minute or two there, kind of setting that up. The climax is pretty quick in most things where you kind of say, here's my idea, this is what I'd expect to predict. And then there's going to be kind of a lot of the work is going to be here on the following action. So maybe 5 to 6 minutes there, kind of resolving things. And then another like 2 to 3. I don't know if those numbers add up to 12 or 15, but I would put, this is pretty quick. This is as quick as it needs to be to make sure you set them up. So you don't want to spend any more time there in the beginning, I think, than you have to. Because unless it's an educational talk where your goal is just to educate people, that's a little different. But if it's a research talk where the point is to get your name out there to show what you did, you want the stuff you actually did to be the bulk of what you're talking about, because that's what you're trying to communicate. So take as long as, get through that first part as quick as you can, have the reveal, focus on this, but then also don't overlook this, because you do want to communicate why it's important, how you think the field has changed, how you think you relate to these other things, that sort of stuff. So probably for most of these, weight it towards that second half. Good question. Any others? Okay. So this is one story arc. There can be all sorts of different story arcs that you can put in there. If you're giving something like a departmental seminar or a thesis defense or something, your story arc may look more like this, where you kind of go, you set a question up, you deal with that a little bit, and that leads to a new question. You kind of have these multiple spikes and multiple climaxes throughout it. And then you might have some flat parts in there. You might try and do something depending on the audience where you're kind of trying to subvert expectations, and you might start with some of that rising action first and have kind of a spike where you present something alarming or surprising right off the bat to really try and get people drawn in. And then you level out and kind of teach them the stuff, introduce the characters, things like that, and then go into the climax of your story there. There's lots of different ways you can do it, and it can actually be really fun to take a presentation that you've already done and then try and map it onto another story or try and mix it up, things like that. But for kind of some of those longer talks, it's not necessarily always going to be that one arc. For most of your 12-minute, conference research talks, that'll usually do the trick because you don't have much more time for anything else. But you can get as fancy and sophisticated as you want to here. All right. So kind of this tail end here is just talking about some things. This would be the point where you have that story. Now, if you're using visual aids, that's probably where you're going to start constructing the slides to, back up your talk, or designing the poster. If you're giving a poster, whatever that is, if you're giving a whiteboard talk, practicing drawing those out, and you're going to kind of map it out and get a scaffolded thing there. But then as you're doing that, you want to think about how you're going to deliver it. And then these are also some things that you can think about as you get after that, once you're actually delivering it, some things to consider or practice just to kind of help you engage with your audience and actually deliver that talk. So I have lots of things to talk about on designing slides and visual design and stuff, but we're not going to do that here. Hopefully I'll have another one of these later, but I can talk to you about that if you want. The most important thing, I think, is to be yourself when it comes to giving your presentation. Your audience is going to be very attuned to how you're being with them, unless you're just really, really great actor. If you're doing something that's not authentic, it's not you, they're going to pick up pretty quickly, and it's probably going to turn them on. So there's no one right way, best way to deliver a talk. My style is I like to move around. I tend to be, I have the structure of the talk in my head, but I don't have it rehearsed. I don't say the same thing every time I give it. I like to be fairly improvisational. And that works for me, and that's my style. If you feel like you need to just be rooted to the podium because it spikes your nerves to be walking around and you just want to stand here, you can do that. If you feel like you need to have your remarks more prepared and kind of have more of a script that you go off, I've seen some fantastic talks that are completely given off a script. And so you can work with that. You can find ways to make that work. If it's not you to move around and improv, don't try and do that. It's not going to work. So just be yourself, figure out what feels comfortable, what feels right. And if you focus on your strengths, and then sometimes, I have to learn strategies because since I don't have a script prepared, I sometimes wander off or things like that. And so you can overcome weaknesses and things like that with whatever your style is. So all that to say, if something I'm saying, you're like, yeah, that does not feel right to me, that's fine. That's not for you to do. That's okay. So one thing I'd like to think that there is ties a little bit into the idea of the narrative arc, but it's a little different. So I went ahead and put it in the wine glass analogy when it comes to your talk. So to make it kind of engaging, or as you're kind of designing those slides and deciding what to put where, I like to think of it, and I did not come up with this as a wine glass on its side. So you're starting broad, and as you go through that talk, you're narrowing down until you get to your topic. You're going to spend, this gets to your time question, spend a good bulk of time here and kind of the narrow part of the topic, and then flare back out and finish broad. But what I think is also nice about this analogy, it shows, the time you spend and the breadth of your content and things like that. But there's also all kinds of different shaped wine glasses. And so you can find the one that fits your talk best, but you can also play around with things like that based on your audience to find a shape that fits your presentation. You can, if you originally did your talk in this shape, you can come over here and try this shape and see what that looks like, and play around with it. One of my favorite things I did with something like this is, if you've been in a department for a while, pretty much everybody hears your research. You're talking at, like small departmental lunches, you're talking at speaker lunches, things like that. You're always presenting your research, you're doing chunks of it, you're going to meetings. So I had the opportunity late in my graduate career to give a departmental seminar to all of the faculty in the department, the grad students, the undergrads. And I originally started just, slamming all of my talks together into one big one. But then I realized everybody's kind of heard all of this. I don't want to bore them, and got really concerned about that like I'm just giving the same thing I've done over and over, and people have heard different parts. So I wanted to try and do something different to try and draw people in, to give them something unexpected, to make them feel like they actually got something out of the hour they spent there. So I started with the Big Bang instead. So I didn't do any of the stuff like, all right, here's Mercury, blah, blah. I said, 14.1 billion years ago, there was a Big Bang. And I walked them through the cosmology of the universe, making a point when all of my characters popped up. So this is when Mercury first appeared through stellar chemical evolution. And then this is when, and this is how much is in the earth. And then this is when these life forms first appeared, and introduced it that way. And so by flipping that talk, and kind of everybody was expecting me to get up and say, so we're going to talk about Mercury. Mercury's an environmental toxin. When you start with the Big Bang, people are caught off guard. And so you can play around with what's going to resonate most with your audience. If they're expecting just a straightforward talk, or if they're expecting something a little more entertaining, engaging, things like that, you can try and swap out what shape you're putting that onto to better resonate with the audience now. As you're designing your slides and you're planning this talk, you also want to be mindful of the concept of chunking. And it's not throwing up before your talk, although if you need to do that, for nerves. But that's breaking your talk down into digestible sections. So the mental image that I have when I think of this, if you use a Windows computer, you've seen this maybe where you're transferring files from, out to a hard drive or something. If you click a little more detail, you get something that looks like this. And so that's showing you the total information. You want to be mindful that your audience can only absorb so much information in the time you have with them. So you want to make sure that you're not throwing such a big chunk of information that they're going to be overwhelmed, they're going to get lost, and that they're going to be able to keep up. But it's also really important to consider the rate of information that you're throwing at them, and that takes mental energy, mental bandwidth. Everything that you show them, everything that you say, everything that you do costs your audience energy in order to be able to take that in. So when you throw up a slide that's really busy and has tons of information, it has 6 different points on it, and you throw that at them, they can only take that in so fast. And so you want to break it apart, show them things at a time, be mindful of how much information you're giving them at any one point, and make sure you're passing it off in chunks that are small enough that they can understand that, they can digest it, and then they can grab the next one. So not throwing stuff at them. I've been doing that a bit here. If you've noticed, I've brought in slides empty. and then brought in stuff as I talk about it. And that's because if I throw my slide up with everything up there all at once, all of you are going to tune out, you're going to forget what I'm saying, and you're going to try and make sense of my slide. So I've just thrown you this big chunk of information. And so then I either need to just stand back and give you a second to digest it and then talk, or I need to break it into small chunks so that way I'm not overwhelming you. So you can accomplish this in a lot of ways. I will touch on one slide design thing here. How many of you use figures or graphs in your work? Okay, this is my hot take on it. Unless you are comparing two graphs directly to each other, there is never a reason to put more than one graph on a slide because you're just throwing too much information at them. So unless you need your audience to look between those and compare, in this graph, it looks like this, but in this graph, it looks like that, just break it up into bigger slides. You get around issues of things being too small. It's not too much information. So consider breaking that out, consider using that principle of chunking. Pauses can be a really effective way to keep your audience engaged. We tend to tune out if we start talking and getting that monotone. There's all sorts of things we can talk about with the pitch of your voice, inflections and things like that. But pauses can be a really effective way to interact and kind of lead your audience through a presentation. So you can use them for emphasis. If I've just done that big point or done something that I think is particularly profound, pause. Because everybody's going to stop. They're going to kind of take stock. They're going to look to me, and that's going to drive that home. If I stop talking, their thought process ends there, and then they kind of reflect on that for a minute. So use it to get emphasis. You can also use it as an attention gauge. So if you can't move around, I talked about that one. Taking a pause, people are going to get out of that rhythm, and you can look and see, you know, especially if you notice people are kind of zoning out and looking, you know, off in another direction, throw a pause in there at a natural point. Don't stop mid-sentence, but throw a pause in, and sometimes that'll kind of help snap people out of it. They'll look back to you. Wait, why'd you pause? What'd you change? You re-engage with them, get that eye contact, and then you can jump into the next part. To catch up, if you're realizing I'm kind of getting out of rhythm here, I feel like I'm rushing, I'm talking too fast, I'm not sure where I'm going, I can't remember what the next slide is. A bottle of water is always a nice cover for this if you have one. Kind of pause, unscrew that bottle, say, excuse me, I need to take a drink. And they think you're just taking a drink. You're giving yourself a pep talk, you're calming yourself down, you're saying what comes next, and just throw a pause in there, give you a chance to catch your breath, figure out where you're going. You can set the bottle down, and then you can launch back into it. So if you're feeling scattered, throw a pause in there, and that can help. So pausing for emphasis to drive a point home, pausing to pull your audience in, to re-engage with them, and then again, it's a great break for you, especially in a long 50-minute talk. If you're doing one of those, you need a break. Give yourself a break with a pause. Also, your audience may need a breather too. So it's not just if you think you're losing them. If you've just gone through a really dense information section and then you're getting ready to pivot to a new one, give a pause. Say, like, all right, let's take a minute, think about that. And it feels awkward. It always feels longer to you up here, but that can help your audience catch their breath as well. Okay. There's also the concept that you're to an extent managing your audience while you're doing it. And so being mindful of how you're interacting with them and how you're, I think of it as kind of the attention that your audience is giving you as kind of a gift that you need to use responsibly and that you need to kind of manage that. So you want to set them up for success. So that harkens all the way back to a lot of those design principles that we were talking about, making sure you're giving them all the tools they need to be successful with, making sure that you're engaging with them in ways that they're going to find interesting, giving them the tools they need to be successful. Thinking of their attention as a resource. So that kind of gets back again to that idea of chunking. They only have so much attention to give you for the entire talk. So if you throw a bunch of really difficult attention intensive things in there for them to understand, you're asking a lot that's probably not fair. So how much attention are they going to have? How long can they go? Using it wisely. and not burning it on things that aren't important, realizing that every bit of attention you draw from them is something that they can't give you later. So being mindful of that and being respectful of that. And then prepping them for transitions. So especially in presentations where you're doing multiple things, you're talking about perfect topics, you don't want to throw them curveballs out of left field. You want to try and prep them for what you're about to do. So if you know I'm about to wrap up this study and then I'm going to talk about something else, tell them that you're doing that. Use a pause, kind of pause and say, okay, so that's this part of it. We talked about this, this, and this. Now we're going to transition over here. So that's for the big twists and turns, but even prepping them for what's about to come next on the slide. I haven't done that as much here, but like if you're getting ready to show them a graph, kind of prepping them. Okay, so we did this study. What are the results we looked like and what did we find? So you're prepping them for the fact that you're about to move over here. So now they're expecting that, and then you click and put a graph up there. They're not like, wait, where'd that graph come from? I'm confused. So prepping them to kind of navigate through those transitions. Smiling, eye contact gestures always go a long way. If eye contact makes you nervous and you feel like, you know, people are looking at you and that sort of thing, looking just above people's heads, they can't really tell where you're looking. So I'm not actually looking at any of you right now, but it kind of looks like I am. So there's ways you can fake it if making eye contact is nervous, but just looking around, engaging with your audience, showing them that I'm aware that all of you are in here can go a long ways. Also realize that's not a two-way street. A lot of people have presentation faces that they go into and they can be really engaged, but they just kind of look like they're staring off into space with no expression. Realize that some people are going to do that. You can sometimes prompt a bit of an expression if you kind of look at a few people. People tend to make eye contact or smile or something there. So you can do something about that, but also realize that they're not necessarily going to be, I always try when I'm an audience member to give feedback and let people know, but not everybody does that. So they may be completely invested in your talk and just staring blankly at the screen, and that's okay. But you can sometimes show that you're engaged there. All right, so we have some time here for questions. I do want to let you all know for more help with this, I'm actually have just started a presentation consultation service at the UC Davis Library. So I have a guide up here. This QR code will take you to it. I have there, that's where you can book a consultation with me. So if you have a presentation coming up that you want help with, you can schedule that. I can sit down with you at any phase during that process if you're trying to figure out what's my story. If you have slides, if you're worried about your delivery, I can help you with that. There's also a presentation resources tab that has a lot of guides and resources for, you know, free fonts, color palettes, image generators, things like that that are really useful. So if you need some resources that are there, those are available. I am going to have to put an unfortunately on this at the moment. So I'm available to do this. I'm about to go on parental leave sometime within the next 2 weeks. So this won't be available for about the next month and a half while I'm dealing with our new family member. But once I get back from that, I'll be available to help. So file it away. It's booked online. If you see a spot that's available, you can book it and it's available, but there is going to be a gap there where this isn't going to quite be ready to go. But with that, if you have questions about anything, questions that I didn't cover, other things, I'm happy to take those, but thank you all so much for your attention, and I really appreciate it. Yes. Yeah, so the consultation can be multiple times. Yes, absolutely. I think that's kind of how much that's a lot of times. We can come early and as we work through what the story is, and we go on the side and do that side and come to practice when I'm going to do that on that. It's really, really well. I've also seen lots of such students who come for small hearings and really refine on that talk. So we get one conference and they come back and talk about hidden. So yes, absolutely.
Yes. Are there some like key differences that you would say are between giving like a short talk and giving like an hour-long talk, other than the amount that you cover?
Yeah, so short talks versus long talks. The short talks, generally you're gonna have just one talk to try to draw those, so you're really gonna focus on that. It's again gonna depend on what that goal is, but it's really gonna be that one up and down, whereas when you're giving a longer talk, you wanna try and avoid just laying stuff together. You wanna try and craft a narrative between all those components as well. So think about, you know, if you've got 3 segments that you tell them about, the order that you put those in there, you might call them chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, because that's the order you did, and then it might make more sense to talk about chapter 4, then chapter 2, 3, and then finish with 1, based on that. So each one's gonna have some story in there. It's kind of like a trilogy, or something there. Each one's got its own thing you want to figure out how to be together and stuff like that. Also, pace is really important there. Sometimes it can be useful for the most complex, intensive stuff in the very beginning, and easier, more intuitive stuff at the end. You probably went out at that point. You go up in, you know, multi-very specific thing, not in the last 10 minutes of talk. Other questions? Yeah.
So if you're crafting your presentation around the one take home, should most of that come from the climax and the following action? Or is it like a combination, or should you just take the following action?
Probably, most of the times that climax is usually if you're in science, your hypothesis, you know, or your theory, your framework, whatever you're considering. That's usually what your climax is. And so usually you want that idea that you're putting out there to be what people walk away with and say, this person had this idea. So it's usually going to be that climax again. Usually be, if it's not the direct take-home message, it is something that builds directly on that take-home message. That probably for a short talk, you want to structure it around your climax and that take-home message. Unless yeah, you could have some other things. I can think of some French cases, but generally, yeah, that's what you want to do.
Sure, then the following action kind of.
Yeah, to kind of reiterate why that's important, why this is actually a good take-home message. So this is the take-home message, and then the fallout or the falling action is supporting that message and give them all the things to say. You should actually remember this. It's, you know, actually good information. Any other questions? Yes.
Thanks so much. It was very informative. I wonder if it's possible to have the PD of the presentation.
Yes, I will talk to the grad pathways folks, and they should have an email list. And as long as they're okay with it, I'm fine with this getting emailed out. So
Thanks so much.
yeah, absolutely. And recording it as well. So I think you should have access to the recording to go back through if you want to watch over something again too. Anything else? Yes.
Question's probably not very related to definitely related to. So I'm quite scared of getting questions. There are questions that I don't know where they come from, and so I'll get scared, and then I'll get nervous, and then it could probably destroy my presentation.
Yeah, it definitely learning how to handle audience questions, and especially it can be really intimidating as a grad student when you look out there and you see, you know, top person in your field sitting there looking at you. Repeating the question back is always a good habit to get into, because one, especially if you're having a recording or things, that can always be a good thing, especially in Zoom world, you find yourself in. But that also gives you time to think through the question. If you say it, you can process what it is. Most people in a setting like that aren't going to have the expectation that you're going to give a fully well-crafted, perfect answer that touches on everything. So I usually try and just latch onto one point that I can kind of address. It's also generally 99% of the time perfectly acceptable to say, that's a really good question. I'll have to give that some thought. Why don't you come up and I'd be happy to take your email down and we can talk about it more after, or I can email you or something like that. So that's something that you'll see really commonly as a perfectly acceptable deflection. Be like, that's a good question. I don't have that answer off the top of my head. I would love to talk to you more about it. And so if you don't have a good answer, that can be a way to then build that into something. And a lot of times, some people are just like, yeah, whatever, and they'll forget about it and move on. But then that actually might be a way that they'll actually come up to you after the talk and talk to you about it. And by and large, there's always that person at a conference who's just there to destroy souls and crush spirits. But most people are there because they generally are interested in the topic, the field, they want students to be successful. And so most of them, it's going to come from a good place where they're wanting to actually help make your research better. So yeah, when you get the question, if you can find something to talk about it, give a good answer. You don't have to touch on all of it. You can say, this is what I kind of think off the top of my head, or having just heard that, this would be my first thought, but I'd want to think about it some more. But those are all things that you can do to kind of, say the question, touch on a point, and then always say, I'd love to talk to you more about it, or I don't know, that's a great question. I'll get back to you on it. Please share your information with me. And then most people are going to respect that and, go on from there. Does that help?
About what you asked your question during your presentation, and then like kind of who and you're trying to encourage people to do that.
Yes. So if you have not set, I set the expectations. Okay, so one, try and set that expectation at the beginning if you can, because then that's going to set you worried about that, and you can say, to get this presentation, feel free to interrupt me, okay, that, or if you don't, say, you can say, I'll be happy to answer questions at the end, and I can head some of that off. Depending on the context you want to head that off, you can just say, I appreciate that. Promise I'll turn the questions to answer to be useful at the end. And then don't wait for confirmation. You just want that answer. Remember, you're in control of it. So that's kind of part of the managing audience. You have really audience for great question. Appreciate that. And get to the end. Please don't let me and then just go back and try and close that. Well, thank you all again so much. Please reach out to me if there's anything that I can do to help with your presentations, or that we can do to help support your research in general. It's literally our jobs to help you. You're not an inconvenience. You're not bothering us. We get excited every time a grad student sends us an email asking for help. So definitely reach out to us. We're here to help, and have a great rest of your day.